As many of you know, in the 17 years I served at St. Patrick's, I was also involved in many diocesan activities as well. One of my favorite things that I got to do for the diocese was lead the lay preacher training program. For 10 years, I was the lead teacher for all the lay people who wanted to be licensed as preachers in the diocese. They went through a 2-year course of study. They met once a month for 9 months, and they learned about preaching, but they also practiced preaching to one another to receive feedback. And one assignment they always had, at least once during those 2 years, is that they would have to preach on the gospel I just read. Now, the reason for that may not be obvious, but you see, most clergy are pretty tired after Easter. And so, if you are the lone rector at a parish and you take the Sunday after Easter off to recover from the Holy Week and Lent and all of the things that lead up to Easter and Easter itself, if you take that next Sunday off, who's going to preach? Well, if you have a licensed lay preacher, that person steps in. If it's a small congregation and they have a priest in charge, then you have a licensed lay preacher and they step in. And every year on this second Sunday of Easter, the gospel is always this story of Thomas. So over the 10 years I helped train the lay preachers in this diocese, I heard a lot of sermons about doubting Thomas. A lot. Far more than I have ever given, because of course I either gave it to my assistants or a licensed lay preacher when I went out of town after Easter. But something caught me about the lesson this week. I have known so much about doubting Thomas over the years. What really stuck out for me, though, was that first encounter with Jesus and the disciples, where he bids them peace and then breathes on them. I mean, clearly here we are looking back at creation itself, when God formed humanity and breathed the breath of life into them. Here, the risen Christ breathes on the disciples to offer them new life through the Holy Spirit. And what is the first thing that happens to them when they are given this breath, when they are turned into this new creation? Jesus tells them, if you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. Now, the church over time has interpreted that to mean that the church has the power to grant forgiveness of sins to those who are penitent. I mean, we just said it at the beginning of Lent on Ash Wednesday, after we did the litany of penitence. The priest says that the church has power to forgive the sins of those being penitent. I think there's more going on here. Something about forgiving the sins and retaining the sins. There is actually something that happens in John's gospel where it is said that someone's sin remains. It's in the story of Jesus healing the blind man. The story begins with Jesus asking, who sinned? He asks his disciples, who sinned? This man or his parents that he was born blind? And they don't know. And he says, well, that's not what it's about anyway. It's about the glory of God. And he heals the man who was born blind, and so he gains his vision. But the religious authorities are threatened by this. They say there had to be something going on. There had to be some kind of sin. They don't deal with the man as a man who can't see, as a human being in need, as a person who has the opportunity for God to work through them. They deal with him as if he is a theological question, and so deny his humanity. And as they do that, as they sit there in their own self-righteousness, Jesus points out to them that because you say you think you see this situation clearly, which they don't. The blind man sees, but the authorities don't. Because you insist, though, he says to the authorities, insist on seeing this in a way where you've got it all nailed down and buttoned up and are sure of what's going on, then your sin remains. In other words, Jesus is leaving them to themselves, their own harshness, which eventually, any human being, if we apply it to others, we will apply it to ourselves as well. But you know, I have noticed how what happens to us when we retain sins, when we fail to forgive others who have harmed us. We sometimes harbor resentment and anger for years. If we retain those sins, we hold on to them, and it can do destructive things to us. I once watched a person die of unforgiveness. Their son-in-law had done something absolutely horrible, and he was convicted and he was put in prison. But they could never get anywhere near forgiving that person. Instead, they just harbored anger and hatred and resentment. And I watched as she lost weight, as she developed more medical problems than anyone her age should have, and eventually died. And her husband said, I know that that death certificate says some kind of medical mumbo jumbo about what she died of, but I know she died of anger. We can hold on to, we can retain the sins of others in ways that have eternal consequences for us. It's said that if we don't forgive someone and harbor all the anger and keep it, even if we have no contact with this person ever again, it's as if we're drinking poison and expecting it to harm the person we fail to forgive. Now, I always want to qualify when we talk about forgiveness, forgiveness is different from reconciliation. Forgiveness is the act of giving up that anger, giving up that desire for revenge, saying that we will not be controlled by someone else's behavior toward us. Reconciliation is about reestablishing relationship, which is not always wise. It's not always wise if people are still capable of causing us harm. Reconciliation takes much longer sometimes than forgiveness. But forgiveness is something that Jesus is calling us to and saying that if we retain the sins of others against us, it may cause us damage. But there is hope for reconciliation, and forgiveness is the first step. I have a very good friend who recently reconnected with his adult son. It was a couple years ago. There were plenty of reasons to be angry. There were plenty of reasons not to forgive. There were plenty of reasons to stay away from one another. But they got beyond that. They reconciled, and they created a relationship again. Sad to say, that son died of a seizure not long ago. And my friend said, imagine what it would be like for me now if I had not been able to reconnect and create that love between us once again. He had the opportunity and he took it, and it made all the difference. And maybe one of the places where we also retain sins that causes us damage is when we don't forgive ourselves. When we retain our own sins through guilt and embarrassment and a sense that we knew we shouldn't have done that or we could have done better, and it eats us alive. I've recently finished watching a series of shows on Netflix called Lucifer. I know it was out on TV a few years ago, but I heard about it, so I decided to watch it across time on Netflix over the last few months. And I was fascinated by this show. The show is about the devil, Lucifer, the archangel Lucifer, getting tired of running hell and deciding to go and hobnob with human beings. And where does he go to do this, of course? Los Angeles. Where else would the devil go? But there's this whole series of events that he gets involved in over time. And occasionally there are theological arguments that are brought up. And one of the arguments was around, well, who's running hell if the devil's not there? And Lucifer says, oh, it takes care of itself. And they say, what do you mean it takes care of itself? Well, everybody who's there could leave. They just choose to stay. What do you mean they choose to stay? Well, they keep reliving the worst things in their lives over and over again. And if they could just forgive themselves, then they would go on. But instead, they relive these things over and over and over again. They could leave. They just choose to stay. And what have we done to ourselves but create our own personal hells if we can't even forgive ourselves for the things we've done? What Jesus is doing in this creation, this new creation where he breathes the Holy Spirit on his disciples and then tells them, if they forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If they retain the sins of any, they are retained. He's being perfectly, dreadfully obvious about this. Just as he forgave others, we are to do the same. And if we retain the sins of others, and if we retain the sins of ourselves, then we're not following the path that Jesus followed. And he's warning us that it can have dire consequences. We are invited to be a new creation, to forgive others, to forgive ourselves. And we can leave the hell that's created when we fail to do that, if we just choose.